What's up guys, Asian here with our first build video of Harrowstorm, and this is going to be the Magicka Dragonknight. So Magicka Dragonknight is going to be a little bit unique compared to the other build videos I will be releasing, mainly because the best build for Magicka Dragonknights is actually uses different sets than what I showcased in the Magicka DPS set video a few days ago. So this video will be a little bit longer than the other Magicka DPS build videos because we do need to go over those specific gear combinations that is unique to the Magicka Dragonknight. You can still, of course, use the builds that gear, I should say, that I mentioned in the Magicka DPS gear video, but if you want to eke out the most DPS, you will need to use this rather unique setup here for a Magicka Dragonknight. Now, the Mag Decay has seen quite a bit of a boost in its overall DPS. It is now one of the strongest Magicka DPS in the game, second only probably to the Magicka Necromancer, partly because Necromancer does have nature vulnerability, and it does have the potential to beat out some of the weaker stamina DPS classes even. So those of you guys who are Mag Decay mains, you guys are in a pretty good spot as of Harrowstorm. But enough about that, let's go ahead and get started into the build. So we'll go over the gear very quickly and then explain why this particular setup is unique and only unique to the Magicka DK. And then we'll go over the different skill setups as well as the rotation. So the gear that I'm running today is going to be Zaan, no surprise there. Then we have Elf Bane. So this is the set that is only useful on Magicka DK. So it increases the duration of our flame damage over time abilities by 5 seconds. If you guys are familiar with Magicka DKs, a lot of our abilities are considered damage over time and they all deal flame damage. So this synergizes very, very well with Magicka DKs. The concept is by using the 5 seconds increased duration on our flame dots, we are able to get more of our spammables out, whether that's Force Pulse or Molten Whip, which in turn increases our damage. It also allows us to cast them less often, which increases our sustain. So this is a very strong set to use for Magicka DKs now. Now, the downside of running Elf Bane is that it is a heavy armor set, and you want to have it active on both bars because one of the primary reasons Elf Bane is so strong is because it also affects sets like Zaan and Grothdarr. So getting the additional 5 seconds on Zaan is incredibly powerful. It makes Zaan very, very strong, so you will need to run this on both bars just in case Zaan happens to proc on your back bar in order to make the most use out of it. This does mean we will be wearing 2 Elf Bane body pieces, so we have the legs and the chest because those will give us the most resistances. That does mean we will need to run light Zaan, so you can see here I have 2 light Zaan pieces. Then we have Siroria here with 3 light pieces here. So this way we still manage to get our additional light armor passes by having those 5 light armor pieces, but we will not be able to run 5-1-1. We are running 5-2 instead because of Elf Bane. Jewelry is going to be Elf Bane. You will need to transmute them because it is a heavy armor set, so it will come in healthy, so you will have to transmute them to Bloodthirsty, Infused, or Arcane. Then we have Siroria as our front bar set, Precise Flame Damage enchant, and then a Maelstrom Inferno Staff back bar infused with a Weapon Damage enchant. Now there is a second setup you can run here, so one of the downsides of running this particular setup is the fact that you don't have very good sustain unless you're running something like False Gods as a front bar set. The alternative set to run here is actually going to be using an Asylum Staff rather than Siroria. And then instead of Siroria here, you're going to be using either False Gods or Infallible Aether for the spell crit instead of the spell damage. So this is the alternative setup that you can run if you want to run the Asylum's Inferno Staff with Elf Bane. So you still want to run Zaan because otherwise Elf Bane loses quite a bit of power. The whole point of Elf Bane is to pair it with Zaan or Grothdarr in order to get the extra bonuses on the Monster Helm set. So we will still be wearing Zaan here, and this does mean we need 3 pieces of False Gods. We cannot use Willpower because Willpower does not come in armor pieces. So we have to use our Minor Slayer boost here. Again, False Gods and Infallible Aether is going to be slightly stronger than Siroria because it provides spell crit rather than Minor Slayer. One advantage of doing this is also you don't have to get the perfected version of False Gods or Siroria either because the two set and the 3-piece bonus remain the same between both of those sets there. So this is an alternative setup here. I have found that this setup pulls a little bit lower damage compared to the previous setup with Siroria, but sustain is a lot better. So I will actually be using this setup here For the rotation itself actually doesn't change too much between the two setups here. Now, everything else pretty much remains the same, so let's go over our bars here. So in terms of bars, so if you're running Siroria on the front bar, you will be running Molten Whip. If you're running Asylum like I am, you will be running Force Pulse instead. So we'll have Force Pulse here. Then the rest of our bar remains the same for both gear setups. So we have Burning Embers, Engulfing Flames, Burning Talons. Be careful with Burning Talons because it does root things. Bosses cannot be rooted, so it's fine to use for bosses, but for trash fights, just be a little bit mindful of this when you use it, because since it root things, you might end up messing up the stacks for tanks. Depending on the trial or the dungeon you're running, this may or may not be a big deal. For example, in Sunspire, not that big of a deal because a lot of the ads that you will be fighting can't really be rooted. So just be mindful of when you use Burning Talons. Use it after the stack is up, not before everything is stacked together. Then Inner Light and Shooting Star. On our back bar, we have Eruption, Blockade of Fire, Flames of Oblivion, Barbed Trap. You can also run the Challenge Acceleration under the Sigil Order line if you are not able to use Barbed Trap. Now you are Mag Decay, so you will be playing within melee range, so you should be able to use Barbed Trap, no problem. Then we have Spell Symmetry if you're running Siroria. If you are running the Asylum build, you have a lot really good sustain, so you can actually replace this with Scalding Rune and actually not lose any sustain at all. And then we have Standard of Might as our ultimate here. Now in terms of our CP point setups, so the CP point setup we have here is pretty much what you saw in the Magicka gear video. However, there is a small difference I do want to point out here. So if you are going to be running this setup here, you might want to shift some points out of Thaumaturge, or into Thaumaturge I should say, because we're really prioritizing our dots here. So what I did actually was I cut a couple of points out of Staff Expert as well as Mastered Arms and Elfborn, and dropped Elfborn and Mastered Arms down to 61 rather than 66, and put those into Thaumaturge, bumping this up to 52. So that's just something that you might want to consider doing for a Mag Decay. You might want to put a few more points into Thaumaturge just because we are using a lot of damage over time abilities. So that pretty much covers it for our skills as well as the gear setup. So in terms of rotation, I'll demonstrate first on this 3 million dummy before we do the trial parse. And I will show you parses from both setups, so both the Asylum Staff setup as well as the Siroria setup. So your dots are affected by Elf Bane with the exception of Flames of Oblivion. Flames of Oblivion actually is not considered a dot, it's considered a direct damage ability, so it is not affected by Zaan, or I should say Elf Bane, so we still have the 15 seconds on Flames of Oblivion. Everything else does get the additional 5 seconds, so you have 20 seconds on Blockade, 25 seconds on Eruption. You do have 20 seconds, I believe, on... yeah, it's 20 seconds on Scalding Rune. And then you have 19 seconds on both Engulfing Flames and Burning Embers, and 9 seconds on Burning Talons. So you have a lot of time between re-upping your dots. The shortest dot is going to be Burning Talons at 9 seconds. Between all that time, you will be using Force Pulse. So the general idea of your rotation is more or less just put down all of your dots, like so. Just activate all your dots and then just Force Pulse away. Just continue to Force Pulse, and then when your dots run out, just reapply them. You can see here, we have a lot of time to use our Force Pulses. And then just keep an eye on your dots and just use them as they start to run out. It's a little bit of a dynamic rotation, but a lot of things line up fairly decently well with a 20-second duration. Roughly speaking, they're all around 20 seconds, so it's actually... it all lines up decently well. It doesn't line up exactly, so there's still a little bit of dynamicism going on here, but generally speaking, a lot of things sort of fall in line pretty decently well here. So now, there are a few things I do want to mention here that you want to watch out for while you're running this build. First thing is both Scalding Rune and Barb Trap do have an arm time. So Barb Trap has a 1.5 second to arm. Scalding Rune has a 2-second arm time. So you do want to cast these a little bit before they run out. So if you let Barb Trap run out and then cast it, you'll actually have 1.5 seconds where it is not active. So you will lose Minor Force uptime that way. So you will need to make sure to re-up Trap Beast, Barbed Trap around 2 seconds before the dot runs out. Same thing with Scalding Rune. The dot continues to run while you have cast the second one, so just make sure to cast it when you have around 2 or 3 seconds remaining on the dot, so that way you don't have that sort of 2 seconds dead time while you're running Scalding Rune. The other thing to note with Scalding Rune is that because of the 2-second arm time, there is a small possibility that they might be able to run out of the radius before it explodes. So you can see about how big the radius is. If it does manage to run out of the Scalding Rune, then you can actually replace Scalding Rune with something else, like a shield. If you want survivability, you can put it with Consuming Soul Trap. If you need some more sustain, for example, or you're running fighting against a lot of adds, you can also replace this with Flame Reach too, if you prefer. So Flame Reach is a Destro Staff ability, and it is affected by Elf Bane as well, because it is considered a dot. So if you're in a situation where you might think Scalding Rune will not be consistent, you can place it with Destructive Reach instead. So Destructive Reach does have a 15-second duration rather than 20 on Scalding Rune. That is one option. The last thing I want to note is that you want to make sure Flames of Oblivion runs out before you re-up it. So you don't want to re-up it a second early or anything like that, because it fires off the fireball once when you cast it at 10 seconds, at 5 seconds, and at 0 seconds. So you want to make sure that last fireball goes out, so that way you're not wasting it. So make sure Flames of Oblivion does run out before you recast it. So that pretty much covers it, and for the Siroria build, everything pretty much remains exactly the same, except instead of Force Pulse, you're running Molten Whip instead. You will note that I also had Spell Symmetry here. Sustain on the Siroria build is going to be a little bit tougher, because you're not able to get the Combustion Synergy to go off quite as often, so you might need to run Spell Symmetry in order to sustain. Generally speaking, in an organized raid group, that is, if you have Symphony of Blaze, Worm, or Hollow Fang, and a Massive Restoration Staff, you generally speaking will not need that much additional sustain, so you might not need to run Spell Symmetry if you're in an organized raid group. If you're kind of plugging things, you might want to run Spell Sim, or you might want to try to find some other way of getting some additional sustain. But enough about that. Let's go ahead and do a 21 million dummy parse so you guys get an idea of how the Mag Decay stacks up against other classes. Do note that this is not necessarily going to be representative of a parse you see in raids, because raids, you obviously have mechanics, you have different uptimes, you have different debuffs active, you have different sustain sources. This is just so you can compare the DPS from a Mag Decay to other builds that I have on my channel. So let's go ahead and get started here. So some of you guys might be wondering why I have Burning Embers or Burning Talons on the front bar rather than something like Flames of Oblivion. That's just because we want to stay on our front bar as much as we can in order to Force Pulse more often. And because Burning Talons is the shortest duration dot, that's why we have it on the front bar. It's the shortest duration dot, so we don't need to necessarily bar swap as often. So we can just, use Burning Talons, and then we'll go right back into Force Pulse spamming. Oh, Eruption didn't cast. Just noticed that. Our DPS might be a little bit lower as a result. I do have a couple of parses that I did earlier, so if it does end up being a little bit lower than what I normally pull, I will pull up those other parses instead. As you can see here with the Asylum Staff, we have no issue sustaining at all. The burning procs that we're getting from the Asylum Staff are helping to proc the combustion passive, giving us a massive amount of sustain bonus here. And this is again with no sustain help. The only sustain that we have help here with is going to be from running Ghastly Eyeball, which is somewhat representative of the amount of sustain you can anticipate getting from all the support you get in raids. Things like Hollow Fang and Symphony of Blades. Okay, so it does look like her DPS is going to be a little bit on the low side for this parse. Yeah, it's going to be a little bit on the low side, so I will pull up the other parse instead. If our DPS doesn't go up by a ton and execute, which it might not. Oh, did I? I don't think I swapped out of Siroria. That might be why the DPS is a little bit lower. So I might be in Siroria rather than False God, and that might actually explain a little bit of the DPS drop here. Because the parse I did was with False God. And yes, the additional crit does make a relatively noticeable difference. So I'm actually going to use Shooting Star here at the end, rather than wait for our standard. And this is something you can also do in raids. If you know the fight isn't going to be long enough for you to get another standard up, but you do have enough ultimate to cast Shooting Star, go ahead and just recast Shooting Star as your ultimate. Get a little bit of extra DPS out. Alright, there we go. So let me just double check. Oh, let's reapply dots out here so we're not pulled into combat. And double check to make sure I swapped to False God. I am in False Gods, okay, so this might just be a little bit of a worse parse. So this parse we pulled 83.4k. The better parse that I got was 84.6k. This is the same setup that I had earlier, so Elf Bane with False Gods and the Asylum Inferno Staff. So just shy of 85k is what I was able to pull here. And you can see that burning does a lot of DPS here, because of the procs that we're getting from our Asylum Staff. Burning uptime is also affected by Elf Bane as well, so while it normally is 3 seconds, with Elf Bane it actually lasts for 8 seconds. So this is the Force Pulse build. Now this is the Siroria build here. Now you will notice here, so just to double check, this is the Siroria build here with Elf Bane. We have the Siroria Perfected Inferno Staff here, so you can see here a little bit different. So Molten Whip is doing a lot more DPS here. Burning is a little bit lower because we don't have as many procs going because we're not using the Asylum Inferno Staff. The other thing that I also want to note here is our sustain is going to be a lot different. So you already saw the sustain with the Asylum build. This is the sustain with the Siroria build. So you can see here we're dipping quite low once we hit around 2.5 minutes. Some fights are going to last this long, so something you want to keep in mind with the Siroria build. If you go over to the False God build here, not False God, the Asylum build here, you can see not that big of a difference. There was a pretty steep drop over here, but really quickly climbed back up once we, this is probably where we had the ultimates, probably a shard and a potion all lined up very nicely together. So you can see here that throughout the parse, no real issues with sustain with the Asylum build here, and it's not actually that big of a DPS difference. So 84.6 compared to 86.7. While it's 2k, which might matter for those guys who are pushing endgame DPS, ultimately it's not that big of a difference. So this build I actually like a lot more, just because I don't have to worry so much about sustain. But that concludes this build video. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys found this informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.